All right, let's everyone come on in. We'll get started. I'm going to start with a word of prayer, and then we will get into our class. Dear God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the many blessings you give us, and we thank you for the freedom and opportunity we have to come and study your word, to learn more about you, and to later on worship you, Lord. I just ask you, please be with all those who are sick and need our prayers, those who have lost loved ones, and then we also continue to pray for the situation over in Ukraine with Russia, and we just ask that you be able to bring that to a peaceful conclusion very soon, Lord. We ask that you be with us as we continue through this class. Allow us to take what we learn here to learn how to become more like you and mimic how you were in your ministry, and then take that, what we learn from you, and how to be like you out into the world to show it to others. And it's in Christ let me pray. Amen. All right, we're on lesson, I believe this, in my notes, this is lesson 19. Now, I could be off by one. We're getting close to running out of fingers and toes, so when we get beyond that, I don't know. Once we get past 20, we'll see. We're going to start with Jesus predicting his death for the first time, and this is a real turning point in the ministry of Jesus. It's really a shift, because he starts to really talk about the hard things that are coming up. He's really, and this is where the apostles' training starts to become a little bit more intense, and you can see, and we're going to look at that today, Jesus' frustration with them becomes a little bit more intense at times as well. And so, because he knows what's coming, and he's trying to prepare them and get them ready for it. So I'm going to read Matthew 16, verses 21 through 28 for this one, but it's also this is also in Mark and Luke's account as well, as you can see in the notes there. But starting in verse 21 of Matthew 16, from then on, so I'm going to talk about this. This from then on is an important phrase. It basically is it's indicating that this is a turning point in what Matthew is writing and what Jesus is talking about and what the apostles are going to experience. So Jesus began to tell his disciples plainly, as before, he would always, a lot of times he'd be like, he would talk to them in parables, and he would talk to them, but now he's just plainly telling them what's going to happen. It's not the kingdom of God is like, this is the kingdom of God. This is what's going to happen. So he describes plainly that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem, and that he would suffer many terrible things at the hands of the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, but on the third day he would be raised from the dead. But Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. Could you imagine taking God aside and telling him that he's wrong? You shouldn't be saying things like that. So pay attention. Now, that's why I like Peter so much, because I could see me doing the same thing. But Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. Heaven forbid, Lord, he said, this will never happen to you. That's a serious consequence. Jesus turned to Peter and said, get away from me, Satan. Some versions say, get behind me, Satan. You are a dangerous trap to me. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's. Then Jesus said to his disciples, and this is where it starts getting deep and it starts getting hard, hitting the things that Jesus starts saying. If any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it, but if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? For the Son of Man will come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and will judge all people according to their deeds. And I tell you the truth, some standing here right now will not die before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So, like I said when I first started that, the phrase from now on was a turning point. We see that in Matthew 4:17 when Jesus starts talking about his kingdom, right? Jesus, up till Matthew 4, it's the start of his ministry, and then Matthew 4:17, he starts from then on. It starts by from then on. He starts talking about his kingdom and the coming kingdom, and at this point, Jesus from then on starts talking about his death and his resurrection and what's going to happen throughout the rest of Matthew. We see that. So we see this new emphasis on his death, because he doesn't really talk about his death and resurrection much up until this point. He may allude to it a couple times, but he doesn't come out directly and talk about it. But the thing is that the disciples still didn't grasp it. They still didn't understand what he had to do. And that's why Peter responds the way he does. Because, you can imagine if you're hanging out with a bunch of your friends and you're saying, close personal friends, and you say, hey, I've got to go up to Valdosta, and while I'm up there, they're going to kill me, and I'm going to, be raised 3 days. Well, you can tell what they did. They ignored the I'm going to be raised in 3 days part, and all they heard was, okay, I'm going up there to die. And so I would hope that my close friends would be like, oh, Chad, you probably shouldn't go up there then. Let's not do that. And so that's kind of Peter's. Yeah, it's like, yeah, why don't you do that, Chad? Go ahead. But that's if you actually look at what Peter's trying to do here, his heart is in the right place. His heart's in the right place. But even and this goes to the warning. Sometimes our heart might be in the right place, but it's still the wrong thing to do. And so we have to be careful that we are, like Jesus says here to Peter, he says, you are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God. We've got to make sure that we're not seeing things just from the human side and letting our human emotions take over, and that we see things and experience things from what God and how God wants them to be and how God intends them. And so we'll look at that. And then so I put down here Peter, Jesus' friend and devout follower, had just identified who Jesus was, right? The lesson before a couple weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, the lesson before this was Peter proclaimed who Jesus was. And now here he is, just a few maybe days or a little short time later, and he's on the bad side of Jesus now. Jesus telling him, Satan, get behind me, Satan. And he wasn't literally meaning that you are Satan. He was using this as an example of, hey, you're falling into Satan's trap, and you're actually falling into doing what Satan wanted. And if you actually look in this parallels with the temptation of Jesus. And actually, I put this, the Bible doesn't say this, but I would almost say from a human standpoint that having Jesus or having Peter say what he said and react the way he did was a temptation to Jesus in itself. Because if you look back in the wilderness, Jesus heard that same message from the devil, right? The same message was what? You don't have to look. All this can be yours. You don't have to suffer. You don't have to. All this can be yours. And if you actually look at a lot of what Peter in his background and some of the others, the way they saw what Jesus was going to be, it was that same mindset. Jesus was going to come down and rule on the earth. He was going to be a ruler over the earth. It was going to be all his. And so there's a parallel there of what Satan was trying to tempt Jesus with, and when Jesus was in the wilderness. And so we can take that, and Peter, not on purpose, obviously, was kind of doing the same thing, saying, "Hey, no, you're not going to die. This isn't going to happen." And Peter and Jesus saying, "Look, no, you're doing you're doing the devil's work right here. You got to understand that." Go ahead. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And so with that lack of understanding, he falls into and almost kind of into Satan's trap there of. Yep. 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 I I know we're going to look at. So I know part of what they and we looked at that last or 2 weeks ago about Peter's confession of Jesus being and we looked at, and yes, they do kind of put Peter as the one who kind of controls the entry and exit, and that's taking it way out of context. And this would be, yep, yeah, 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 exactly. So definitely, I mean, you can see that the clear taking out of context with that. So, I mean, and Peter was just as human as everyone else. And mainly his reaction here is, I don't want to see my best friend, die. And my best friend's talking about going and getting killed, and yeah, yeah. I mean, you look at Peter's story, and that's I think I like Peter because I think we all can relate to how Peter is. It's like where we can be gung ho and passionate one minute, but then the next minute we get afraid, and it's like, oh no, that's I don't know who that is, and so. I think that's why Peter's a good example for not all of us to follow, but maybe to learn from. So later on, he starts in verse 24. He gets into the if anyone wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way and take up your cross. Now, when he told the apostles this, they knew what that meant. To us today, it's like we don't truly understand what the cross meant. Carrying a cross really meant. We kind of get it. Some of us get it. Most of the time when we think of a cross, you're carrying your cross. We think of the guy who, the people who takes the cross and walks cross country with it, or does things like that, or does the Easter. You'll see that people taking their cross, or before Easter, a little bit, and it's not the painful, bloody, nasty thing that it actually was. Whenever Jesus told them, hey, you're going to have to take up your cross, that meant certain death. That meant you must be willing to certainly die if you're taking up a cross. This isn't you might die taking up your cross. This was, if you're going to follow me, then you must be willing to die for sure. 100%. And so, yep, yep. Yep. Yeah. And if you look at the historical accounts, now a lot of it's not biblical accounts, but if you look at the historical accounts, almost every one of the ones who were there this day did. Some of them on a cross, some of them in different torturous ways. But according to historical accounts, everyone who was there suffered and died for Jesus in some way. And so I personally, some people say, well, this message is for the apostles. It really isn't for us today. I think this applies just as much to us today as it does the apostles. Now, we don't have to really live it out because, I mean, in terms of Christianity and American culture and where we live, we don't really have to worry about this. It's not something we think about, right? We don't have to worry about. We don't have a invading army who has taken over our country, who, which they'll see, governs and tells us we can and can't do things, and if you do those, then we're gonna execute you. We don't have to worry about that. Now, there's people in other countries who do, and so when they read this verse, it's a very serious verse to them because that applies to them. And so we need to make sure that we take this and understand what this truly means for us, because we don't understand, we don't know what this is like. To think, well, if I'm going to be a Christian, then I might possibly have to give my life up, or for sure have to give my not just my life in service to God, but my actual physical life. Go ahead. Yeah. I mean, we really, and I'm not trying to be hard on the American church, but I mean, it's just the situation we're in. We have become, what is the least amount that I can possibly do and still get through the pearly gates? All right? How many times do I have to go to church a week? All right? How often do I have to take communion? How often do I have to give? How often do I have to do these things and make it through the pearly gates? And I know Dad's had people actually ask him that question. What's the littlest I have to do and still be saved? And if you have that mindset, then I'm just going to tell you right now, you're not getting through the gates. All right, this is the mindset you need to have if you're going to want to. I mean, the idea of getting through these gates, or whatever you want to say, of being saved, of being a follower of Jesus, it's giving your life over to Him. It's not giving Him Sundays and Wednesdays, or maybe a night in the week sometime. It's your entire life, and that's what verse 25. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. Right? We want to have both. We want to have a foot over here, right? And we want to have a foot in the world still. And we kind of want to try to split the difference. And this is what Jesus said. Jesus said, no, it's 100% or it's not at all. There's no, he writes about that in Revelations. There's no riding the fence. There's no lukewarmness here. You're either all in for Jesus or you're out. It's not a halfway. It's not a half committed thing. It's not, well, I want to do a little bit. And I think that's the scary thing. I think this is why I think Satan's got us in a good spot. Well, for him anyways, let me put it that way. For him is because the American church really isn't 100% yet or all in for God. If you look at most churches, they're not. It's more of a Sunday, Wednesday, a little bit of a thing. But the actual giving 100%, dedicating everything to Jesus, dedicating your life to Jesus, it's not even close. Go ahead. No. Yeah. And I know sometimes we be careful how I say this because I don't want it to sound like I'm wishful for it, but I don't know. It's one of those things we complain a little bit about when we got locked out from COVID, and we complain a little bit about some people passing some laws that upset us and stuff like that, and we lose our minds as if we're being persecuted. No, we're not. I mean, we got a little bit here and a little bit there, but sometimes I wonder if Jesus is or God or isn't just going to be like, you know what? Let's show you what it's really like, and then see how the church does then. You look at the number of members the church has lost just because of COVID. Now, don't get me wrong, COVID was terrible. This time a year ago, me and Helen both had it. It was horrible. I was sick as a dog, sickest I've ever been in my life. It wasn't fun. But you look at the number of people, Christians, who have fallen away in the last 2 years just because of COVID. Yeah. And we think that we're going to survive a true persecution. And so, I mean, we need to, this is when Jesus is talking, that's why I highlighted all this, because, Jesus is being very serious here. I mean, he's always serious, but when he hits this, he is being very, very serious and plain spoken about what it is to be a follower of him. And it's not a half-hearted thing. And so that's why I'm sorry if I'm going along on this one, but I want y'all to understand and get the impact of what these verses meant and what Jesus expected out of them. So if you go on, I think I've hit a pause at most of these. The last one, one of the last ones I put there, if we protect ourselves from the pain of God calls us to suffer, we begin to die spiritually and emotionally. I've seen that. If you try to keep yourself from actually experiencing any pain or any suffering, there's no growth. I mean, honestly, some of the greatest spiritual growth I've seen comes out of pain and suffering. It's almost like when you learn things, You can learn something's not hot, right? You can see that something's not. You can understand. But you truly get an understanding for it when you put your hand on that hot stove or grab that hot plate that's been in the oven, or a hot pan that's been in the oven. You grow a lot more through that painful experience. And it's the same way spiritually. So Matthew 16:28, the last verse there. There's a lot of the different theories around what this verse means. And it says, I tell you the truth, that standing here right now, some stand here when I die before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, there's some people who take it to the extreme to say that there's people that some of the apostles are still alive today because they haven't seen Jesus come back yet. Now, that's way out there. Not very many people believe that, but you believe it or not, there are some people who believe that. If you look at what I put down here, most scholars believe, one, he was talking about the transfiguration, which we're going to look at next, or that was referring to the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus, or the day of Pentecost when the church was finally established. And I think, personally, this is Chad's research, I think it's a combination of 1 and 2 on there. I think it is the resurrection and them seeing Jesus, and then him and his ascension, and then the coming of the church after that. There are people who, I think it's a combination of those two, of them seeing Jesus resurrected and seeing Jesus' church, or the kingdom, the church of God, or Christ, established on the day of Pentecost. I think that's what he was referring to there. Obviously, none of the apostles are still alive today. Yes. So, and there would have been several people who were there listening to what he was saying, who would have been not only at the resurrection, or witnessed the resurrection, witnessed Pentecost, and seen all those things. Now, there are some who may have died, or some who may have fallen away during his rest, but there were a lot of them who were there all the way through that. And so I think that's what he was referring to there. All right, any questions? Yeah, it would be Pentecost, yeah. That was the fulfillment. Yep. Yeah, 3,000 so plus people. So it definitely very powerful. All right, the next one is the next time is so I don't know if it's a couple of days or around this same time. Jesus is transfigured on the mountain. And this parallels with Moses and some things, and we're going to see this. But Matthew 17:1 through 13. 6 days later, I knew it was a few days later. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter and the two brothers, James and John, and led them up a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed so that his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared and began talking with Jesus. Peter explained, Lord, it is wonderful for us to be here. I bet that would have been an experience. If you want, I'll make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. But even as he spoke, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my dearly loved Son, who brings me great joy. Listen to him. The disciples were terrified and fell face down on the ground. Then Jesus came up and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. And when they looked up, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus. As they went back down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Then his disciples asked him, Why do the teachers of religious law insist that Elijah must return before when the Messiah comes? Jesus replied, Elijah is indeed coming first to get everything ready. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, but he wasn't recognized, and they chose to abuse him. And in the same way, they will also make the Son of Man suffer. Then the disciples realized he was talking about John the Baptist. So one of the things we don't fully understand is why Jesus chose these three. There's no explanation. The only thing we do know, and I've documented this in here, is these were the three, what we call Jesus' inner circle. Right? These were kind of seemed to be the ones who were closer to him. Of the 12, the closest to him, and kind of experienced more of who he was and what he does. And if you look, if you go back at what we've looked at, one, they were the first three to be called to Jesus, right? To hear his call, who he reached out to. They were the first three there. If you look at the list, like in Mark 3:16, if you look at the list of all the disciples, they're the first three listed. I think it's the same way in the other Gospels as well. And they were present at certain healings where others were excluded. So it seems like, if you go through and look, that Jesus spent extra time with these three, and kind of focused and did more to help these three understand what was happening. And so that's why he probably chose these three to go up on the mountain. So, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder, it's one of those, I guess, almost nature-nurture arguments. Did Jesus know who they, like, the influence they were going to have, and so he spent extra time with them? Or did they have the influence they had because Jesus spent the extra time with them? Maybe a mixture of both. But for whatever reason, these were Jesus' three closest of the disciples or the apostles that he spent the most time with, and they were witness to things that others were not because of that. So it doesn't explain Jesus' full reasoning for that, but we can see that played out in the rest of the New Testament. The Transfiguration was a vision, a brief glimpse of the true glory of the King. This was a special revelation of Jesus' divinity to these three disciples. They got a special, beyond seeing the miracles and the other things, they also got a special insight of, one, kind of seeing who he was with his face changing, and then also, God coming down in the form of a bright cloud, as it's described here, and speaking to them. And so we see that they're able to see this, and it just goes further to define and affirm who Jesus was, and everything, to emphasize all the things that he was saying, and so they could see who he was and what he was talking about was true. The other thing, too, here is Moses and Elijah are the two greatest prophets in the Old Testament. Right? Moses is the one who established the law, and then Elijah is the one who represented the prophets that started foretelling of the coming of the Messiah. And I got the notes in there if you want to go back and read through those. You can see that. So Moses and Elijah's presence with Jesus confirmed who he was, his mission. And that was, one, to fulfill God's law and the words of God, words of God's prophets. And so, just as God's voice in the cloud over Mount Sinai gave authority to the law, God's voice at the Transfiguration gave authority to Jesus' words. I think go ahead. Yeah, yes, almost identical. This is my son who I'm well pleased. So it's interesting that Jesus. We've been talking when we first started out in the early part of the Gospels. We talked so much about how Jesus paralleled Moses' ministry and who Moses was, and then paralleled a lot of the Jerusalem and the covenant and all the timelines, and you see that, and he just continues to do this. The mountain speaking, God speaking, and proving who he was. So it's interesting how he again continues to show his authority through these things and fulfilling and showing that he's the New Jerusalem. So this is where Jesus, he starts telling, he says, he told Peter, James, and John Like, do not talk about this until after I've resurrected. It's not until you understand it better or until after I'm gone. It's until the resurrection. You don't talk about this, which was interesting. But I think the reason was, and I think we see this in verse 10, was they still didn't truly understand what was going on here. They were still being taught. They were still figuring this out. And the question in verse 10 says that. They ask, I lost my place where I was at. But, they asked the question about, I'm sorry, I was looking at Luke, does Elijah still need to come? All right? And the question is, that you can tell that they're thinking, well, if you're the Messiah, then when's Elijah going to come back? Right? Because Elijah's got to come back first. And so then Jesus explains to them, Elijah's already come back, just in the form of John the Baptist. He didn't quite say it that way. He basically says, look, he's already come back, and he's already prepared the way, and he's already suffered, just like Elijah did. And then the light bulb goes off in their head, oh, that was John the Baptist. And so, and that was based on Malachi 4, verses 5 and 6. And then Jesus, referred to John the Baptist as fulfilling those roles. So you can see that they're still, they've got to be overwhelmed with what they're experiencing, right? I mean, you look, this is a 6-7 day time frame, maybe 8 days. It's like Peter confesses who Jesus is, and then all of a sudden Jesus is like, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. Y'all need to understand this. And more than likely, you're going to suffer too when this happens. You've got to be willing to die. And then Jesus is like, hey, come up here with me. And they're exposed to God, through a cloud and then through his face. And so I could not imagine the overwhelming emotion and confusion still in trying to figure these things out. And what Jesus is doing here is he's preparing them and he's teaching them, but he knows they're not 100% ready yet. And that's why he tells them, hey, don't talk about this until after my resurrection, then you will be able to truly understand what all this was. And like Dad already said, they did, and they were some of the most influential disciples and apostles in the church. All right, any thing else before we get the next one? Yeah. Crucifixion? Yeah, I think it's not too much. It's about a year, I think. Like you said, I think it is about a year. Yeah. And as we know, a year, especially preparing for something like this, really isn't that long. I mean, you look at it. We've officially been in COVID for 2 years, and it doesn't even seem like it's been that long. I mean, you think about it, it's like, wow, that seems like it was just a little bit ago. And in some cases, it seems like it was forever ago. But But a year really is not. It's a fast timetable when you're preparing for something like this. Oh goodness! I mean, everything that. Yeah, it was a lot. So they go on, and now they're coming down, and Jesus is going to heal a demon-possessed boy, and this is where I talked about. This is where Jesus' frustration with them really starts to show a little bit. And you can see why, I'll talk about it. Matthew 17:14-20. At the foot of the mountain, a large crowd was waiting. So they've come down the mountain. A large crowd was waiting for them. A man came and knelt before Jesus and said, Lord, have mercy on my son. He has seizures and suffers terribly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. So I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't heal him. And Jesus says, you faithless and corrupt people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me. Jesus, it's almost like Jesus is mad. He's like, come on. I've just been up on the mountain. And so we'll get into this a little bit. Then Jesus rebuked the demon in the boy, and it left him. From that moment, the boy was well. Afterwards, the disciples asked Jesus privately, why couldn't we cast out the demon? And he said, you don't have enough faith. Jesus told them, I tell you the truth, if you had the faith of as small as a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it would move. Nothing would be impossible. And so we see here, Jesus is coming down from the mountain. He's, just kind of, really revealing himself to who he was. He's seen all these, he's done all these miracles. He's been training the disciples. He sent them out. And so he's getting, a year away from his death. He's got all these things coming on, and he comes down and it's like, Jesus, we need your help. Your disciples weren't able to heal this guy. And so I don't know exactly what Jesus' 100% attitude was with this. Why such the frustrations? But he said their faith was too small, and it is. I wonder if they were trying to rely on their own power, like their own strength. As I would say, I think a lot of times we try to do things, and it's like we don't rely 100% on. We want to pull ourselves up from our bootstraps, and we want to, we're strong and we can do this, and we forget sometimes that we need to keep our faith and use the the power of God. And so, and I put on there is this power of God plus our faith that moves mountains. All right, the mustard seed was the smallest particle imaginable to them at that time. And Jesus said even faith as small or undeveloped as mustard seeds would have been sufficient. And so the other thing here is Jesus wasn't condemning the disciples for substandard faith. He was trying to show how important faith would be in their future ministry. If you are facing a problem that seems as big as unmovable as a mountain, turn your eyes from the mountain and look to Christ for more faith. Only then will you be able to overcome the obstacles that may stand in your way. And then I'll get into it. But the one thing I wanted to look at here, and I don't know how many of y'all have seen this, and I'm sure, but that is a mustard seed. Now, there's some people who've tried to claim it's the smallest seed in the world. It's not. But in Jesus' time, he was using a common reference or a common thing that they would have been very familiar with of how much faith they needed to have to move an entire mountain. That's not a lot. I mean, if you think about it, you're looking at someone's finger, that's the tip of your finger. And so this is where he's trying to make the point to them, look, you don't have to have this, no Christian has to be this powerful, all-knowing, know every verse in the Bible and then fully understand all the Greek and all that stuff. You don't need to have all that. Now, it's good to strive for that. It's good to strive and constantly read. But you just need this much faith to be able to do big things for God. It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter if you've memorized all the Bible verses. It doesn't matter if you got a master's or a doctorate in divinity or ministry and all those things. None of that it's about your faith. And the littlest faith can make the biggest impact that we can see in the church for God. And that's where I think a lot of his frustration was coming from, is because he had been spending and teaching, and it's like they still just weren't getting it yet. And so I think he uses that, as an example of part of his frustration. I don't know if you've ever used a harsh tone maybe before to get someone's attention. You're not doing it to be mean, you're not doing it to be hateful, but you're doing it so that they get and understand what you're trying to say and how important it is. So, I'm sure he does. Yeah. Because I see in the world a lot of times we'll put a whole lot more faith in this and not in worldly things a lot of times than we will Jesus. And so it's a picture that really gets to you. I mean, you look at that. I mean, on the screen it looks big, but you compare that to the size of your finger and how small it is on the tip of your finger. It's almost like a little bit bigger than a grain of sand. Yeah. Yeah. I gotta come up, put up with y'all again. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good That's a good thought. Yeah. He just come back from being in the presence of God, right? Even though he is God, right? The Yeah. 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 No. Whips. He turned over tables, And I like that because that does, like you said, it does show the human side of it. Yeah, I mean, how many of us have gotten frustrated and snapped at someone? you know, I don't know if I've quite called. What did it? Well, let's go back to that. You faithless and corrupt people, right? Yeah, 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 yep. Right. Yeah, he got irritated, and you see that. Yeah. Yeah. All right, well, I got 3 minutes, so we'll get this last one. This last part is Jesus predicts his death a second time. So he predicts his death. He goes through this. He's going to predict it again. So if we look at Matthew 17, 22 and 23. After they gathered again in Galilee, Jesus told them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of the enemy. He will be killed, but on the third day he will be raised from the dead. And the disciples were filled with grief. And so I highlighted this, and I put again, so Jesus again is predicting his death, right? He's letting them know. He's like, I want you to understand this is what's going to happen. But unfortunately, and sometimes like we do as humans, or we do a lot, we only heard they only hear the first part of that sentence, right? On the third, but they ignore, on the third day he will be raised from the dead. They ignore that part. And they really don't understand it, or a lot of them believe it until it actually happens. Because we see after his death, a lot of them are, some of them are scattered, some of them are, hiding in rooms because they don't get it. They don't understand. They weren't sitting there waiting at the tomb. All right, he's going to pop up out of here in 3 days. They weren't waiting for that, And so, and they're shocked when Mary finds them. The tomb empty, they're shocked, and then they run, or Peter, I think it is, runs to find the tomb. So it wasn't, you can tell they really weren't expecting that to happen. They didn't listen to what Jesus was telling them about what he was going to do. And the other thing is they didn't know that Jesus' death and resurrection was what was going to make the kingdom possible. That they still couldn't get over that idea of him coming and ruling and conquering. And how we see that. He was going to come and conquer, but he was conquering through his death and resurrection. So, go ahead. Yeah, and through us, yeah. Yep. And so the last part I put on there, we shouldn't get upset at ourselves for being unable to understand everything about Jesus. All right? The disciples, the apostles who spent years with him, didn't understand everything about Jesus until they were given it, all that knowledge through the Holy Spirit. And so we need to make sure we don't beat ourselves up if we don't always get it or always understand it. We just need to make sure we keep the faith and understand that faith. And that last line, despite the question and doubts, however, they believed, and we should do no less. We should always have questions. We're going to have doubts. We're human. And I personally think it's good to have questions and to question things, right? You don't learn unless you question and ask questions, and doubt things too. You don't learn. But the thing is don't do it to a point where you just walk away. but do it to a point to where you continually learn and you continually grow. If you just listen and accept everything that's told to you, you're just a drone, right? But if you actually question and look at and dive into the things, and this is what the disciples did. They did this on a regular basis. They were constantly asking Jesus questions. Well, why is this? Or why did you say this? And we need to make sure we're doing the same thing about Scripture. So I won't be here next week, but I think Chris is going to teach. I got to get with him, but I think Chris is going to teach next week. But when we get back, we're going to go further on, and we start really getting serious more and more further closer to Christ's death, and then we'll continue into that. Thank you.